The people who are most worried about that are actually the scientists. And there's a lot of protest and concern. I see it a lot at MIT, or you read the science journals, it's full of it. Contrary to what a lot of people think, when the universities, of course, research is supported from the outside, obviously. Like, universities don't sell their own products. By now they're starting to do that, but not much. Up through the big growth period after the Second World War, it was federal government funding overwhelmingly. A lot of it Pentagon, some of it National Science Foundation, NASA, Atomic Energy Commission, mostly sort of around the military system. And during that period, it was very free. So at MIT, which is super Pentagon university, there's just no interference from the Pentagon. You do whatever you feel like. Because they understood that there was also no secrecy. They don't want any secrecy. The reason is that they more or less understood their role. Their role is to be a funnel for passing public funds into private pockets. Okay, that's essentially the role of the Pentagon, and the universities are part of it. MIT's, Stanford, Johns Hopkins, huge parts of it. They fund research and development. And then, if anything works, you hand it over to private corporations. Like, take, say, the Internet. Okay, the Internet was, all the ideas came out of the military, the ARPA, the research agency in the Pentagon. It was implemented in the universities under military contracts. This includes the software, the hardware, packaging, parallel processing, advanced microprocessor design. The whole business, all publicly funded. It was, as long as that was going on, it was completely free and open, military funded for a long time. Finally, the NSF took it over. They've just, a year or two ago, handed over to private corporations. Okay. They didn't see the point of it for a long time. The big entrepreneurial geniuses like Bill Gates didn't see any point to the Internet. As recently as 1994, he was refusing to go to conferences on the Internet because he didn't see any money that you could make out of it. Finally, the light dawned, and they realized they can take it over and make a mint out of it. So now it's handed over to private power. But the point is, as long as you have government funding, especially military funding, there's very few constraints. You can study what you want, do research on what you want. There's some, they want to direct you to some things rather than others, but it's not enormous. Mostly it funded basic science and not particularly applied engineering. Actually, the same was true. There's another technique of public funding which is less obvious, and that is by allowing a monopoly. So as long as AT&T was a monopoly in the telecommunications industry, they could raise prices. A monopoly can raise prices to whatever they want. Raising prices is a tax, but then they could use that tax to carry out basic research. So Bell Labs, which was there as long as AT&T had a monopoly, did fundamental research. And that's where they developed transistors and information theory and a lot of basic physics and cosmology and so on. That's, again, public funding. It looks like it's a private corporation doing it, but they can do it only because they're a monopoly and they can tax the public. So it's basically another technique of public funding. As soon as the monopoly was broken, Bell Labs went out of existence, okay? Because they couldn't tax the public anymore. There's a move in the last couple of years away from federal funding and towards corporate funding. It's not too great. The reason it's not too great is because the ultra-reactionaries in Congress are trying to block it, because they understand, guys like Newt Gingrich understands that you want to have federal funding because you don't want rich guys to pay the costs. You only want rich guys to make the profits. So you want to distribute, you want to socialize the costs. He understands that. So therefore he wants to keep the NSF and NIH budgets high and the Pentagon research budget high. You notice that they're staying high. And it's the congressional so-called conservatives who are keeping them high because they understand the way the system works. But there has been some change, a shift towards corporate funding. And the shift towards corporate funding has exactly the effects you'd expect. Corporate funding is short-term. They want a product. Like if Merck Pharmaceutical funds a project in the Harvard biology labs, they want a product for them, not for their competitors, right? They want it short term, like, you know, they want it in a year or 2 years or something, not 20 years from now. And furthermore, they impose secrecy because they don't want anybody else to hear about it. Now, they can't formally impose secrecy, but they can effectively impose it by the threat of not refunding. So you get more, the effect of the shift to corporate funding is short-term projects, you know, very applied work, cut back in basic science, increase in secrecy, and it harms the long-term profitability of the, you know, of private capital. So I suspect it's not going to go too far, but it's kind of implicit in the shift to privatization. All of these things just follow along with it, and there's a lot of resistance to it, and in fact hasn't gone too far in those respects. Now, there's another kind of corporatization of the universities which is also going on, but this is since the early 70s. That's in the humanities mainly, in the social sciences and so on. There was a lot of concern that in the 60s that the universities were getting out of control. You know, just too much independence. And in the 70s there was a counterattack. That's when the big foundations started coming along, and, you know, the Olin professorships of this, that, and the other thing, and a big effort to try to just use the power of the purse, which is, you know, what those guys have, to turn the universities back into conformity. And they mostly are concerned with the most concern is with the kind of policy-related areas. Like, they don't care that much about, you know, ancient history. A little, but not much. What they do care about is, say, economics or political science or something like that. And in those fields, it's very orthodox. Like economics, for example, is really narrow. I mean, not much is tolerated. In political science, maybe a little more. In the humanities, the same thing's going on. So you get people giving, you know, $20 million to have a program in great books, meaning you study what we tell you. You know, don't read this other stuff like women writers from the third world and all that kind of business. So there's a lot of that going on. And that's, I don't know if you want to call it corporatization so much as just private power wanting to ensure that discipline is imposed. And that's visible. I mean, the universities actually, even the right-wing elements don't like it much because they don't want to be dictated to by rich people. So, for example, Yale, if you notice, just turned down, finally, a big grant of, I don't know, $20 million or something, a lot of money, for some humanities program where the guy who gave the money was insisting on having a role in appointment of professors. And that's just too much interference with private prerogatives, even for a pretty right-wing place, you know. So it's conflicted, you know. But it's... I mean, it's not that the universities were free before. They all, you know, their universities depend on wealth. You know, like 95% of the population doesn't fund the universities. They get it's private wealth, or else public money through taxes. You know, and that's like the Pentagon. That's public money, and it's. There was a big change in the 1950s, huge expansion of the public funding of universities mostly through the military system and other related things like NSF and NIH. And that's so far maintaining. I mean, NIH and NSF budgets have not dropped. They're kind of stable, even increasing slightly.
I have a question about thinking.
About what?
About thinking.
Thinking.
It seems like
I don't know the answers.
In order to have for radicals to pass on the institutional capacity to analyze critically and develop theory, there's a capability there that many of us have not developed or have developed, you know.
Well, most people got it knocked out of them. Right. I mean, children have it.
So the question is, as radicals, as a group, as a movement, how do we develop that, maintain it, and strengthen it, that capability?
Well, you know, I mean, I don't know. Nobody knows. I mean, there's some kind of elementary things that can be said. For example, it's very hard to do alone. it takes a very weird person to be able to sit alone, you know, in the midst of a big propaganda system and say, I don't agree, you know. And if it's not just that you get, you know, stomped, but it's just hard, you know. On the other hand, when you do it collectively, it's a lot easier. If there are people, I mean, thinking, in fact, is collective. Like, take, say, science, you know. I mean, it's very rarely done by an individual. It's an interaction. If you're in a, say, a graduate science course at MIT, it's, you know, the graduate students are talking, they're not copying, taking notes. You know, they're supposed to challenge and think and tell a professor he's off the wall and so on and so forth. It's a cooperative activity. And it's just as much true in any other area. You think by trying out ideas and getting somebody's reaction and then telling you something, and people bring in things you didn't know about and so on and so forth. So like you know, any kind of significant radical activity, it's going to have to be in organizations. And that develops thinking. There's no other than that. It's just you know, you figure it out for yourself. Nobody has any techniques. I mean, you have to keep an open mind, be skeptical. You know, ask for evidence when somebody comes up with a conclusion, that sort of thing. But you know, it's all kind of anything that's, you know, either it's obvious or nobody knows. I mean, that's I think that's the general answer. Yeah.
Back to what you were saying about this sort of limited corporatization of education. Are you talking primarily about the U.S.? Are you talking about the Philippines too? Is it not happening at a greater rate and differently? Or
in different countries?
Talking about the whole world? Or
well, I was talking mostly about the United States.
Right.
There's some very, in fact, what's true of the United States, as far as I know, is true of most of the industrial world. It's different in different countries. I mean, even within the industrial world, there are differences. So the United States has a much freer higher education system than almost every other industrial country. It's part of the reason for U.S. economic success. One of the good things about the United States is it had a mass education system. The European countries did not. They had an elite education system. After the Second World War, they did open the universities up, but they didn't provide facilities. So in you go to Italy, let's say, everybody can go to, you know, the University of Rome, except they haven't got any facilities for anybody. Okay. Here the system developed in a rather different way. The facilities developed along with the opening up. Okay, so a lot of people here can go to college, a large part of the population. It's less true elsewhere. Furthermore, the universities in Europe and in Japan particularly are very authoritarian. It's not so much true of England, but in continental Europe, the universities are extremely authoritarian. I mean, a professor has enormous power, and people have to conform. You know, that's very true to a much less extent here. The universities are, in fact, much more democratic for all kind of historical reasons, and that harms things. There are other differences, but the move towards you know, making education more vocational and more applied and more short-term and more connected to corporate interests, that's happening to some extent throughout the industrial world. Maybe less here than in places like Holland. In the third world, like, I don't know about the Philippines, I just don't know anything, but because I haven't been there, or, you know, I haven't followed it, but various parts of the third, it just varies a lot. I mean, there's some places that are opening up, there's some that are, I don't think there's anything general, not that I know. Like in parts of Southeast Asia, the technical education is growing very fast. So in, say, Malaysia and Thailand, there's a lot more kind of engineering education than there was 20 years ago.
Would that be to export highly skilled people, like, or?
Well, they don't want to export the people. The West would be happy to have them export the people, because that's that's a way of getting other people to, like, for example, the United States and Europe are quite happy to get engineers or doctors trained in the Philippines or Malaysia, and then they work here, because that means those people pay the costs and we make the profit. In fact, there have been a lot of Philippine, Turkish, and other doctors here, meaning the cost of the education is theirs, but the benefits are here. So the immigration laws are almost every country are set up so that trained, skilled people are allowed in, unless they have a surplus and they don't want the competition, then they may stop it. But if there's like a shortage of doctors, you know, then you bring them in from the third world. So they don't, and those countries don't want to export their doctors. Actually, this is causing very complicated problems in a lot of places. I think I mentioned, at least to some people, that I was in South Africa a couple of weeks, about 2 weeks ago. One thing I was interested in was the role of Cuban doctors in South Africa. I wrote about this in an article in Z a couple of weeks ago, but that was just from the newspapers. And I wanted to see it on the scene. You know, what do they think about the Cuban doctors? And it turns out to be quite complicated and interesting. There's a lot of opposition to the Cuban doctors on the part of the certain sectors of the population, including the medical profession, but others too. And on the other hand, in the rural areas where they go, there's apparently a lot of support for them because they're there. It turns out to be quite a complicated story. Under the apartheid regime, they were bringing in doctors from the black African countries, like Ghana, say, and Kenya, and so on. So doctors from those countries were coming into South Africa, which is a rich country, and being sent off to the black rural areas. Okay. Now, the surrounding countries didn't like it, because it's a brain drain. You know, like Ghana is training doctors, and they end up in South Africa. So for Ghana, it's a loss, you know. The Mandela government, when it came in order to stop this sort of robbery of the surrounding countries, prevented doctors from coming from the surrounding black countries. So they stopped that arrangement, okay, as a gesture of solidarity toward the surrounding black countries. But of course that meant there's now a shortage of doctors in South Africa. The white doctors don't want to go out and work, and they want to, you know, live in Johannesburg and be rich. And the new black bourgeoisie has the same intention. They want to live in Cape Town and Johannesburg and so on and make money and be specialists. So what happens to the whole country? Well, the black doctors who were providing some services, not fantastic, but at least some services, they're now cut off as a gesture of solidarity to the surrounding countries. And Cuban doctors are coming in, but that leads to extremely complicated relations of, you know, attitudes towards what's going on. Like, why do we have to have Cuban doctors when we could have had black doctors, say, from Ghana? So there's that kind of feeling. And then the medical students don't like it because they're, you know, being undercut to a certain extent. So it's complex. That's one kind of brain drain problem. And you find other things in other third world countries. Last week, just a couple days ago, I was in Israel and Palestine. And there it's extremely tricky. Like, they badly need doctors in the occupied territories. But the medical system, which was always bad, is collapsing totally. But where are they going to get them from? Israeli doctors don't want to go. Egyptian doctors refuse to go. They hate the Palestinians. The Palestinian doctors, say, if they're trained in Israel, they now have a niche in Israeli society. So the Israeli doctors tend to go into the Jewish Israeli doctors tend to go into specialties because they make a lot of money, you know, and that leaves an opening for general practice. And the oppressed section of the Israeli population, namely the Palestinians, they're using that opening. So they'll move into general practice at a lower, you know, much lower salaries, while the Jewish Israeli doctors go into private practice. But that also means they don't want to go off into the territories where it's really tough work. You know, they're very poor and oppressed, and, you know, dungeons basically. So there's a big problem. And there are many other problems. But I don't think there's anything general that you can say about the third world. It's, every place I've looked at, it's just different from place to place.
Are the trends you've been speaking about in U.S. universities, do you think they're responsible for a lot of what's coming out of the academic left, mainly postmodernism? Do you think that has a particular place in the doctrinal system, mainly people wanting to be subversive but not rock the boat, or do you think there's some other explanation for that?
Well, you know, individuals have their own reasons, and you have to look and ask why they're doing things. But if you look at the phenomenon as a whole, its effect has been, I think the effect is pretty clear. It allows people to take a very radical stance, you know, more radical than thou, but to be completely dissociated from anything that's happening for many reasons. One reason is nobody can understand a word they're saying, you know? So they're already dissociated. It's kind of like a private lingo, and it's very, you know, there's a lot of material reward that comes from it. Like if you're part of that system, you can run around to conferences and get big professorships and, you know, all this kind of stuff. So there's a lot of sort of conventional material reward, and it has this very radical look to it, so you feel, you know, well, let me just give you an example. I gave a talk a couple days, last Saturday, at Birzeit University, you know, the Palestinian university at the West Bank. And it was a, you know, like everywhere, big mass audience, political talk, mostly criticizing the Palestinian Authority, because I was in, you know, you always tell people what they don't want to hear. So I want to criticize Israel, I do it on the other side of the border. And the audience, most of the audience, you know, very supportive, and they liked it and they understood it. The guys with the jackets and ties were pretty angry, but that's normal. However, as I left with an Arab friend of mine who organized it, he's actually an Arab, he's an Israeli Arab who's a member of the Knesset, the parliament, but an old kind of good guy. He sort of he was sitting in the back of the, and as we walked out, he kind of laughed and he told me that you know, he said most of the, especially younger people, liked it a lot, but he heard one really critical comment from a young woman faculty member who sort of liked the general political thrust of it, but told him it was very naive. And I said, you know, why was it naive? And he laughed and he said, well, it's because you said that people do things on moral grounds, and you talked about truth. Okay, and that's old-fashioned nonsense. You know, that's kind of this old Enlightenment stuff. We know perfectly well that nobody does it. I mean, I talked about how apartheid was overthrown, you know, and how it was necessary to have splits inside the white society, which there were. If the white society had been unified, they would have smashed the ANC. But there were splits from the inside, and basically on moral grounds. People didn't want to tolerate it, and that was quite important. Something, you know, talked about that. Well, that's naive, because nobody does anything on moral grounds. All power plays, you know, read Foucault and so on and so forth, if you can understand it. And truth is kind of like an old-fashioned concept, you know, there's no truth and so on and so forth. Yeah, that stuff goes on all over. I mean, the next day I gave a talk at an Israeli university, and then it was critical of Israel and the United States, and talk about the Palestinians. And there were commentators, and one of the commentators was the dean, and he, you know, he hated it, of course, and a historian. And he also said it was naive, because I was talking as if there's a objectivity in history. I was running through the history of what happened and saying how you should interpret what's going on now in those terms. It is complete naive. I mean, everybody knows there's no objectivity and there's no truth, and it's this narrative and that narrative and so on and so forth. That's very convenient. It sounds very radical, you know, and it's extremely convenient. You can beat people over the head with perfect, you know, self-confidence, because there's no reality anyway, and it's just their narrative and your narrative. In the third world, it's particularly grotesque in my opinion. It's bad enough here. I don't like it here, or other rich countries. But when you get to third world countries, it's really grotesque, because you know, there the separation of the radical intelligentsia from popular struggle is a much more, you know, it shows much more dramatically. I mean, people are much poorer and they're suffering much more, and these guys are usually very rich, in fact, often, and it's ugly. But I think it has served a function. I don't want to say that the people who are involved in it necessarily do it for this reason. In fact, I know extremely good people who are very active and, you know, I respect and like and so on, who are right in this stuff. I don't know why, but means something to them. But as a general phenomenon, I think that's the way it's worked. It's worked as a way of insulating sectors of a kind of radical intelligentsia from popular movements and actual activism, and it served as an instrument of power. I suspect that's the reason why it's so readily tolerated in the universities. I mean, it's all over the place, in the third world as well, you know, because of the function it serves.
There are people who believe that the programs of the right and the left make them diametrical opposites, inherent enemies that goes on forever. There are others who seem to feel that there's some possibility for communication between the right and the left, people like us and the militia movements and so on. Do you have any thoughts on that?
It depends a lot what you mean by the right and the left. So, for example, the Cato Institute is right.
I don't mean that.
Okay, but look, I mean, for years, until before Z was founded, in fact, the only journal in the country that I could write for was the Journal of the Cato Institute, because we agreed on a lot of things. I mean, we disagreed fundamentally on basic things, but on, say, state terrorism, a lot of things in international affairs, intervention, so on and so forth, we agreed. And it was pretty open, so I could write things there. Well, that's right-left. If you look at the militia movements, I think they're a pretty complicated phenomenon. Like, take somebody like Timothy McVeigh. You take a look at his background. You know? I mean, he's a guy who fought in the Gulf War. I mean, who knows what experiences he went through. It wasn't very pretty, I'm sure. He's somebody whose life has the community that he comes from, the sector of the population that he comes from, their lives have completely fallen apart. I mean, in the last 20 years, their incomes have declined sharply. Their wives have to go out and work to put food on the table, which they don't like from the culture they come from, and you know, nobody would like. If people want to work, fine, but they're forced to work, you know, just to survive. The kids don't pay attention to him. You know, there's the whole world of the way he perceived it is falling apart. So, you know, you lash out. You lash out at he didn't blow up a corporate headquarters, notice. You blow up a federal building because you had it drilled into your head that the enemy is the government, not because of the bad things the government does, but because of the good things it does. Namely, it supports, you know, it has some function. Part of its function is to serve the public interest. That's why it's attacked so much. But that's all he hears. You know, federal government is the bad guys, so let's go blow them up. Well, that's kind of, you know, you have to understand that. It's not coming out of nowhere. These are parts of the population that back in the 1930s would have been organizing the CIO. Well, that option isn't open at the moment, so go to other ones. I think there's, in fact, if you go back to the union organizing days, it was bringing in sectors of the population that were very destructive before. If if alternative options are open, same sectors can become very constructive. Is that a bridge between the left and the right? Well, if you make it, you know. I mean, I don't know Timothy McVeigh, but I think people like that could be made to understand that their enemy is not the federal government. Their enemy is private power, and the federal government, insofar as it's run by private power, which is most of it. There's been a kind of interesting shift in just mass entertainment in this respect over the years. So I've been told, maybe you know better than me, but you go back to the 1950s and say television, the FBI was just, you know, gods. Now I think the FBI is, if you look at a standard cop show, the FBI is the bad guys. It's the local police who are the good guys, and the FBI is coming in and screwing everything up, you know, and they got to get them out of their hair and so on and so forth. I understand that that's been quite a considerable shift. And if you think about the way the FBI was glorified back in the 50s, it's a pretty remarkable shift. Well, I suspect that that's part of the general propaganda of trying to make people hate the federal government, but support the parts of the federal government that protect them from all kind of enemies and in fact funnel money to rich people. is kind of nuanced, but I think that's happening, and you see that in the militia movement. Let's attack the federal government as the enemy because not private power, and of course let's keep the Pentagon, you know. And they don't know that the NIH and the NSF are doing the same thing.
Yeah, I want to ask how these propaganda things work. For example, we've watched wages go down, 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 down over a couple of decades, yet nobody thinks they're underpaid, they are overtaxed. And, you know, this is obviously a propaganda ploy, but
Yeah.
who and how does this sort of thing, I mean, all of a sudden there's this big full-blown tax revolt that has, where did it come from and how?
You know, look, I mean, you live here just as much as I do. Everything that reaches people is you're overtaxed, you're giving the money away to these pointy-headed bureaucrats and these welfare mothers and these third world countries and so on, and you're suffering because you're paying too much taxes. That's all anybody hears. Mm-hmm. Well, you know, it's very hard when you're sitting alone and you hear nothing but this flood of stuff to say, wait a minute, you know, maybe I'm not over, maybe we're undertaxed. See, it's interesting, if you ask people, you look at polls, the same people who say that they're overtaxed say they would like to have more money spent on education, on mass transportation, on preservation of the environment, actually even on welfare. If you don't call it welfare, because welfare has been demonized, but if you take a look at a poll where they say, should we guarantee health and you know, sufficient food and decent living conditions for everybody? Yeah, most people say yes. If you call the same thing welfare, they say no. You know? If you ask people to estimate how much of the federal budget goes to welfare, they give estimates which are kind of, you know, like off the map, way beyond anything that it is, like a third of the federal budget or something. That's a standard estimate. If you ask people how much money should go, they give estimates that are higher than the amount that does go. Same with foreign aid. You ask people how much money should the United States spend in foreign aid, they give the standard answer is way higher than it is. If you ask people how much money do we give for foreign aid, they think it's way too high and ought to be cut back. Well, you know, that's not that people are bad. You know, that's what they hear. What they hear is we're giving all our money away to these, you know, third world people who are living in luxury, and I'm working hard. Why should I give my money to them? On the other hand, if you say, well, should we give this amount of aid abroad? They say, yeah, sure, a lot more, in fact. So where does the propaganda come from? Well, you know, you see it every time you turn on the tube, and every time you read the newspaper, and every time you read the journals of opinion, and so on. It's constant. I mean, the United States is, in fact, undertaxed. If you look at the actual facts, which are available, they're not hard to find. The poverty level here is, the United States has the worst record among the industrial countries, bar none, in things like child poverty, hunger, you know, inequality, and so on. Just about every measure, it's the worst. If you want the latest figures, UNESCO, which still barely exists, just came out with its 1997 report, which is just data, you know, just data on things like child poverty and mortality and so on for the countries of the world. It's just alphabetical. But if you look at the industrial countries, the United States is flat out the worst. Okay. Now, where does that come from? Okay. Well, if you look at actual income, the United States is not the worst. So if you take, say, if you look at the distribution of income from, say, wages, the United States is more or less like other countries. So how does it get to be the worst in child poverty and inequality? Well, because it's the worst in transfer payments. So, for example, in France or Sweden or whatever, the government intervention, which means the public intervention to provide people's needs, has a kind of progressive character. Okay, so it shifts funding to some extent from the rich to the poor. In the United States, it doesn't. So if you look before transfer payments, the U.S. isn't off the, you know, redistribution, whatever government redistribution there is, like welfare and stuff like that. If you look before that, the United States is sort of the norm. If you look after it, it's the worst. Well, that's because we're undertaxed. and not only undertaxed, but regressively taxed. I mean, every country is, but the U.S. is worse. And that disparity shows it quite strikingly. It's that component of the system, the transfer payments, in which the United States is by far the worst. End result is we've got hunger, child poverty, you know, starvation among the elderly, you know, all these things that other countries don't. And it's because we're undertaxed. But, you know, how many people know this? I mean, how many people read the, you know, biennial report, State of Working America, which has all this data? Like, you know, people we know, that's who reads it.
Somebody's supposed to be reading that and then getting...
Well, I'm reading it, you can read it, you know. But it's not going to go to the mass of the population. Okay, because in order to get to the general population, see, like, I can read it because I'm a university professor, right? I got free time, I have resources, I got money, you know, I have all these things that make it possible to do it. Suppose you and suppose you have a couple who are working each 50 hours a week to put food on the table. They're not going to read this book. They don't even know it exists. You know, they couldn't even know that this data exists. They wouldn't know how to find it if somebody told them it did exist. I mean, they're not part of that tiny privileged sector of the population which can do these things. Well, okay, that's what radical organizations are for, to make it available to the general population. I mean, that's what a labor movement is for. A big part of the labor movement was always worker education. Like when I was a kid, my family was mostly first-generation immigrants who were working class. They knew all these things. A lot of them never went to school, you know, but they knew all of these things. In fact, knew them very well, you know, better than the people in universities. Yeah, they were part of a lively, organized labor movement and political movement. Actually, the political movement was often the Communist Party back in those days. But whatever you think about it, it was a political, I didn't like it, you know, but it was a political movement that brought people in and gave them a way to participate. Well, okay, the labor movement, the political movements, and so on, they can make these things available.
But so much of it is misinformation. Is somebody sitting out in a think tank saying, this week we'll demonize working mothers, and this weekend we'll attack daycare, and I will talk about divorce some more and say how awful that is, and the morals, you know, all this stuff. Why is the misinformation?
Why is it there?
I guess
because the misinformation is very much in the interests of people with privilege and power.
Okay.
So, and since they have the privilege and power and resources, why shouldn't they put it out? I mean, what do you expect them to do? Tell the truth? Why should they?
First of all, objectivity is dead and truth is dead, and that's the objective truth.
Right.
Do you ever think that maybe just the fact that Noam Chomsky is allowed to run around and talk and that maybe that is proof of the power of these propaganda machines, that, or the whole system, that it can allow someone who's saying your version of the truth to exist as they're still doing their own thing?
Well, what would be the alternative?
We'll be winning when you're shot.
Yeah, I don't understand exactly what. I mean, like, who would see? Remember, this is more or less. I mean, it's not a capitalist society. A capitalist society couldn't survive for 3 minutes. But if you look at the spectrum of world societies, this is toward the capitalist end. Okay. Now, in a real capitalist society, everything is a commodity. You know, everything's available. You get as much as you can buy. Okay. And that's also true of freedom. And if you think about the United States, it's very free. I mean, the amount of freedom is very large compared with other societies. And you get as much as you can buy. Well, I can buy a lot. Okay. Furthermore, other people from my same class background would not want the state to have the power to act against me. So if the state were to act against me, I would get supported by rich, powerful people because they don't want the state to have the power to act against people like them, namely me. Okay? Well, for ugly reasons, you get a lot of freedom. And actually, this covers quite a large part of the society. On the other hand, if you're a black organizer in the ghetto, you can get murdered because nobody cares whether the state has the power to go after them, you know. And they don't have the resources to buy a lot of freedom. I mean, it's a very unequal class society, and I suspect all of us, certainly me, benefit from that in the sense that we can buy a lot of privilege. That's why we're here. You know, how many people have the opportunity to spend some time in a place like this? You know, you got to be part of a fairly privileged sector even to be part of it. Okay, and this is a rich country, super rich country by world standards. So a fair number of people are in this position, including working people. You know. But it doesn't mean that those are the only people who can organize. I mean, you go to, say, you know, really poor countries. For example, take, say, India, a very poor country. I was there about a year ago. There's one part of there's a provision in the Indian Constitution that says that calls for village self-government. Says villages have to be allowed to, you know, have to have self-government. Formally, it's supposed to be it's a rural society, so this is, you know, millions, hundreds of millions of people. Of course, it's never implemented. I mean, the villages are always run by landlords and gangsters and soldiers and so on. But there's two sectors of India where it works. One of them is Kerala, the other is West Bengal. A friend of mine who's an Indian agricultural economist, radical, took me through the West Bengal part. And I mean, I was surprised. It is really true. You know, you go to a village unannounced, you talk to the, you know, people get together, you see who's running the village, there's a village committee. They've broken down caste distinctions and gender distinctions, which is no joke in rural India. So the village committee is half women, all castes. You know, the head of it's a landless worker. One of the members of the village committee in one of the villages we went to is a tribal woman. Tribal women are below anything, you know. I mean, even below the untouchables. So it's doubly, you know, low, namely women and also tribal. But she was right there sitting in the village committee. They answer questions. I've been in places where they're supposed to be collectives and cooperatives, like, say, Vietnam. And when you go to the collectives, it's clear that they never worked. I mean, you start asking people in the village committee, you know, questions about the budget for next year. They don't even know what you're talking about, you know. On the other hand, which means that somebody else is running it. Here they knew, you know. They could answer any questions you asked. The detailed answers, you know, took you and showed you what they're doing. I mean, went around. As we were walking through the place, we happened to, there was a building with some milk cans, so I asked somebody what it is. And they didn't know, but we went over and saw it, and turned out it was a women's cooperative, milk cooperative, that village women had set up on their own, you know, and not so much to make money as just to work together. In fact, they weren't making any more money than when they had their individual cows, but they were doing something together. Well, you know, and you see things like that, when you go around, there's no water. Until very recently, they had no water. You know, you had to go somewhere and carry water on your shoulder. But now they have, the water level is not very low, like it's about 30 feet you can get water. There is primitive but functional technology, primitive pumps, that women, it's only for women. In fact, they showed us with considerable pride how they do it, took it apart, you know, stick it in and so on. And they maintain it and run it, and that means that there's water for like a group of 3 or 4 families will have water. All of this stuff is in the last 10 or 15 years. These are very poor people, you know, but it's relatively prosperous by Indian standards. How did they get it? Well, it turns out when you look back at the history, there was a very brutal guerrilla war fought, you know, counter-insurgency war fought there in the 1970s under the Indira Gandhi government. I didn't even know about it. I'd sort of read about this stuff. But it turns out there was, the government sent in troops, tried to destroy it. They were beaten off, you know. These guys fought and they won. You go past the house where the landlord lived, you know, the big fancy estate, there's nobody there, the landlord's gone, you know. Lands are divided up, run cooperatively. Okay, you don't have to be rich and powerful to achieve things. In fact, quite the contrary. So there's a lot of opportunities all along the line, but people have to work. You know.
It seems one of the last huge corporations to still be under attack from the government is the tobacco industry. And with the proposal of the $300 billion over 25 years, what do you think is going to happen?
Well, a couple of years ago, I listened to, somebody gave me a tape, an interesting tape of a talk given by a guy whose name, believe it or not, is Charles Whitebread, who's a professor of, he's a law professor at UCLA, and he's the leading specialist in the United States on the history of prohibition. Very conservative guy. He was giving a talk to the California Judges Association. It was quite an interesting talk, and I was sort of interested enough to look back and read his articles. He has, you know, a whole issue of the University of Virginia Law Review and a couple of books and so on. It's about the history of prohibition, especially the history of marijuana. He did very fascinating work on this. He's a very right-wing guy, you know, but it's very intriguing. One of the things he pointed out in this talk, it was about 10 years ago, he predicted that the government was going to make tobacco illegal, okay, to the California Judges Association. And he predicted it on the basis of the history. He said, look, if you look, you'll notice that smoking is becoming class-related, which it very strikingly is in the United States. It's a class issue. Like, you know, you get a graduate student at MIT. I haven't seen an American student smoke for probably 15 years. The only people who smoke are foreign students, or, you know, some older people. On the other hand, if you go to the you know, junk food place where the teenage kids hang out, the poor kids, they're all smoking. They all have 2 cigarettes in their hands. It's becoming a class-related phenomenon. And what he pointed out is that the history of prohibition, you know, ever since the early 19th century, has been that if some behavior, some form of behavior, is associated with, you know, what are called the dangerous classes, it gets prohibited, gets criminalized. Okay, so behavior that's associated with the poor and, you know, immigrants and bad guys, that tends to be criminalized. Marijuana is a very striking example, in fact. There's never been any medical, when I read I thought, you know, when I read the detailed history, mostly his work, it's pretty interesting. There has never been any medical testimony indicating that there's anything dangerous about marijuana. In fact, the American Medical Association and all those guys were against the prohibitions because they couldn't find any evidence for it. You know, there's nothing wrong with it as far as they knew. Probably not good for you, but nothing is. But it wasn't harmful. It was first criminalized when Mexican immigrants started coming in, Mexican workers. In fact, the first place to criminalize it were the places in the South, the states in the Southwest. And they associated it with Mexican, you know, the Mexicans were the ones doing it, and they're the dangerous classes, so we make it criminal. Then it started spreading in the United States. In fact, the peak of marijuana use was in the late 70s, but there was very little criminalization. You know, not a lot of people were sent to jail for smoking marijuana. The reason, it was rich white people. You know, it was, you know, kids and students in fancy universities. You don't send those guys to jail. So the level of criminalization was actually low, though the level of usage was peaked. In the 1980s, that began to change. There was in the 1980s, there was a decline in the use of any kind of substance among educated people. And by that I mean everything from tobacco to drugs to red meat, you know, to coffee. I mean, all of this stuff started to decline, more or less steadily, among educated, more wealthy people. On the other hand, it remained stable in the poorer sectors, or even increased. Okay, at that point, that's exactly when the criminalization started. When you were going to get, it was going to be a war against poor black people mainly. That's when criminalization started, okay? I mean, it was technically illegal, but the laws weren't applied until then. That's when the war on drugs began. In fact, it was pointed out at the time that this is just a war against the poor. You just look at the trend lines, you can see exactly who's going to go to jail. You know? Well, now what about tobacco? He pointed out that the same thing is happening with tobacco now. It's becoming class-related. And as it becomes class-related, it's going to probably get criminalized. That's the standard. Actually, prohibition in the United States was sort of the same. Prohibition was not aimed against, you know, rich people up in upper New York State. They kept drinking as much as they liked. The point was to close the saloons in New York City, because that's where poor working-class immigrants are getting together, and those guys have to be stopped, you know. And that's pretty much the way it worked. In fact, sometimes it's astonishing. Like in Britain in the 19th century, for about 20 years, they criminalized gin, but not whiskey. Well, it turns out gin is what poor people were drinking, and whiskey was what rich people were drinking. You know, so anyhow, he predicted tobacco will be criminalized, and I think that's now what we're seeing. It's becoming a behavior pattern of the poor, and behavior patterns of the poor call for for punishment, no matter what the behavior is. And furthermore, one more word. He noted, and if you look at it, it's true, that the tobacco companies were expecting it. They were diversifying. So now the tobacco companies make a huge amount of money, like Philip Morris, one of the top corporations, but take a look at where their income comes from. It's not so much coming from sale of cigarettes in the United States. It's sale of cigarettes abroad and sale of things like cereals in the United States and other things. They're now a conglomerate, you know. They sell all kind of things. And the tobacco sales are oriented more and more towards the third world, where they can use the force of the U.S. government to open up the markets. So like there's a threat to countries abroad that unless they open their markets to U.S. poisons and advertising aimed mainly at women and children will close the U.S. market to them. That's a strong weapon. So they are, and his prediction, he's probably right, is they're expecting criminalization.
You don't think that the tobacco industry has their hands in the politicians' pockets?
Yeah, but you know, they've got other ways of making money. I mean, they cannot change the fact that smoking is becoming a class-related issue. That's just a phenomenon. And one of the effects of tobacco use being class-related is that there's a likelihood of criminalizing the behavior, or at least penalizing the behavior, because it's poor people and working people and so on. So you want to penalize it and maybe even criminalize it. And they've been looking at that and are diversifying into other products and also aiming at the third world. So sure, they've got their, you know, they're one of the biggest funders. Philip Morris is one of the biggest political funders. And they, you know, they're going to hold on to what they can, but I think they probably see the handwriting on the wall and don't care that much.
What was the name of that book?
The book is by B-O-N-N-I-E, Bonnie is the first author. He's also a law professor, and Whitebread. And it's called The Marijuana Connection or something like that. They spell marijuana with an H. It's a hard book to get, but it's around. I got it on interlibrary loan from some university around here. And it's a sort of history of the criminalization of marijuana and other things. It's quite an interesting study. There's another one that just came out, which I haven't read yet, which probably covers much of the same ground. It's by a guy named Lester Grinspoon, Grinspoon. He's a medical researcher, a pretty well-known one, who's been fighting for legalization of marijuana for many years. He's a New York physician, I think. And I forget the title, but it's just flipping through it, which is all I did. It seems to cover some of the same ground. We can go on for a while, yeah. But it's an interesting topic. Yeah.
You guys want to take a break?
You want to take a break? All right, let's take a break for a few minutes. Yeah.
You want to take a break for a few minutes?
Yes. Okay. Whoops. I got to take.
Just want to leave it on, I can just shut it off.
International financial system in the early 70s. After the Second World War, there was an arrangement. You know, the Bretton Woods system was established, which basically made the United States the world's banker. Remember, the United States was super rich at the time. It practically had half the world's wealth, for example. Everybody else had been smashed. The U.S. gained enormously during the Second World War. Industrial production more than tripled, and everybody else was smashed. The United States was way ahead before the war started. So it was really in a position to run the world, like nobody in history. And part of that system was an international financial system in which the dollar was linked to gold, had a fixed price in terms of gold, you know, so it was kind of like a gold standard, except it was a dollar standard. And every other currency was linked to the dollar. And then the IMF had a complicated set of regulations which allowed some, you know, controlled shifting in relative currencies depending on specific economic situations in particular countries. But it was a very regulated international financial system based on the dollar, which meant the United States was in effect the world's banker. So if more money is needed, you pick up dollars. By the early 1970s, it was getting hard to sustain that system. Europe had recovered from the war. Japan had, to everyone's surprise, become a major industrial center. And it was kind of like what they called a tripolar economy, you know, three centers: Germany, Japan, German-based Europe, Japan, the United States. The United States still way ahead, but anyway, it was more diffuse. So, for example, in 1950, the United States had half the world's wealth. In 1970, it was about a quarter, which is still a lot, you know, but it's not half. Anyhow, and then the Vietnam War came along, which was extremely beneficial to Europe and Japan and even places like South Korea. It was a big shot in the arm for them. And it was harmful to the U.S. economy. Actually, the harm to the U.S. economy is the main I think the main achievement of the anti-war movement. The anti-war movement produced enough internal turmoil so that the government could never declare a national mobilization. If there had been a national mobilization, like during the Second World War, it probably would have worked as it did in the Second World War, very beneficial to the economy. It also would have smashed Vietnam totally. But they couldn't, so they had to run on what was called a guns and butter type war, you know, sort of keep the population quiet because there's so much opposition. And that's harmful to the economy. It caused stagflation, you know, stagnation and inflation, which was uncontrollable. So there were internal economic problems. The rivals, Europe and Japan, gained. The U.S. was in some difficulty. Probably the system was unsustainable anyway. And in 1971, Nixon just dismantled it. Again, that's one of the prerogatives of power is if you don't like the international treaties and arrangements, just dismantle them. So in violation of GATT and everything else, Nixon simply dismantled the international trading system and also imposed import duties, which is also illegal, to block imports from elsewhere, and, you know, wage constraints and a bunch of other things. That actually was in accord with what a lot of economists were recommending, because it opened up international financial exchanges to free markets, which is supposed to be a great thing, you know. And Milton Friedman was predicting that it's going to stabilize currencies and everything will go to the market value and so on. Had a totally, like almost every prediction of professional economists, came out the opposite. You know, it turned into wildly chaotic international economy, huge ups and downs. You know, the whole thing was blowing up. No, and then it turned into what some international economists, Susan Strange, very good international economist, call a casino economy. Pretty conservative international economist in London. So it's like a casino. You know, goes out of control all the time. Nobody knows what's happening and so on. But one effect was a huge expansion of short-term speculative capital flows. So a huge amount of money started being spent just in short-term transactions. Just to give you some numbers, in 1970, about 90% of the capital in international exchanges was related to the real economy, either investment or trade, 10% speculation. By 1990, the figures had reversed. By 1995, according to UNCTAD at least, it's about 95% speculative. And it's a huge amount. I mean, it just exploded. It's now supposedly over $1 trillion a day, moving up and back between financial markets. And that just completely overwhelms the currency reserves of even the rich countries, like the United States or the European Union. Their total currency reserves don't come close to that. And that means that and what does that international capital do? Also, it's very short term. Like about 80% of it has a turnaround time, meaning, you know, you invest and it comes back, of under a week. And most of it is under a day. And a lot of it is within a couple hours. So it's just really moving very, very fast. And what it's looking for is high interest rates and low growth. So if some country tries to stimulate its economy, like if President Clinton, suppose he gives a talk in which he says, he makes some hint that he might do something to stimulate the economy or social spending or something, just a hint. Okay, there's 3 news agencies now: AP, Knight Ridder, and Reuters. Yeah, and Reuters is in fact the biggest, believe it or not. The 3 of them, they do very little news reporting. They mostly do financial reporting. You ask, say, a Reuters correspondent what they do. They have a mobile phone. You know, they go to the talk, and if they hear some word that says, you know, maybe we'll do something to stimulate the economy or increase social spending, everybody runs out on their mobile phone. They call some central database, and they say, Clinton said so-and-so, you know, and comes back verifying Clinton said so-and-so, and they say, yeah, and then it immediately goes out to all the markets over the world, because that's what their audience is, you know, speculators, financial markets, and they say, you know, Clinton indicates stimulation of American economy, everybody sends their money somewhere else, you know. And that's like $1 trillion suddenly moves from one market to another, because they're moving away from growing economies. They don't want that, because that, you know, might lead to inflation and cut down the value of money and so on and so forth. Well, the effect of this, and it was understood a long time ago, it was understood right away, you know, early 70s, that this is going to be that this fast speculation is going to drive the world, the global economy, into kind of a low-wage, low-growth equilibrium. Also high profit for financial institutions especially. And that's pretty much what happened. There were other things that influenced it too, like the development of, you know, telecommunications came along at the same time. The big growth in telecommunications came along at the same time. And that makes it very easy to do things like this, a lot easier. So for example, the whole, you know, Tokyo is the opposite time zone from us, more or less. So like you can get the whole of the New York stock market over to the Tokyo stock market within a few seconds, you know. And that means you can keep it working 24 hours a day, basically, the money. And that's how guys like George Soros and those characters, you know, get super rich, by playing little games with currency speculation and so on. It has a terrible effect on the economy. It's just drawing money away from productive investment, and it's also attacking growth. It's attacking growth, and it's attacking benefits. And it puts government sort of in hostage. Well, can it be controlled? Yeah, of course it can be controlled. In fact, it's like it's not out, you know, it's not like some active, like an act of God or, you know, a law of nature. In fact, proposals to control it were made right away by very mainstream economists. James Tobin was the first. He gave a talk at the presidential address at the American Economics Association, in which he pointed out what a lot of people were thinking, that if you put a small tax on short-term speculative transactions, like, you know, in a day, that'll slow it down, put sand in the gears, you know, because it'll be a little more expensive. So it'll slow it down, and there'll be more money transferred over to productive investment and so on. There's a lot of technical debate about whether you should do it that way or some other way and so on. If you're really interested, there's a book that just came out called The Tobin Tax. This thing is called the Tobin Tax, in which a lot of, you know, World Bank economists and hotshots and so on have technical articles on whether it would work and whether you should do it this way or whether you should do it that way and so on. But the general consensus is probably something like that would work. There's a lot of similar proposals. Well, you never know whether these things are going to work until you try them, because nobody really understands the economy. You know, it's mostly kind of like a mystery. But the proposals could work, and they could be tried. They aren't tried because the financial institutions like it. Furthermore, it's an interesting fact which has been discussed, is that even though the manufacturing sector of the economy is harmed by this, you know, because the money's going away from manufacturing towards financial institutions, they're still supporting it. And the reason they're supporting it, probably, I'm quoting actually David Felix, who's a good international economist who's written about this, he suspects that the reason they're supporting it is because it's a terrific weapon against social spending. If any country does carry out social spending, this weapon blocks it. So say, you know, like GM, which would like to have more money going into manufacturing rather than financial speculation, nevertheless approves of this because it's a weapon against social spending and against the labor movement and so on. So there's sort of secondary effects that make it worthwhile. That's had a big effect on the international economy. It's probably one of the major reasons for the, maybe the major reason for this steady decline in, say, wages and income for most of the population. That's been either stagnation or decline. It's been going on for around 20 years. Sharper in the United States than other places, but, you know, there's similar phenomena in other countries. This is worse, but England and the United States are the worst, I guess, but similar in other industrial countries. Well, it's controllable, but you know, it's happening. That was a big change. The end of the Cold War also had an effect. I don't think it had a major effect, but one effect that it had was, I mean, that Eastern Europe was the original third world. You know, it kind of pulled out of the third world during the communist period, which is a monstrous period, but it did develop the society. So it became an industrial society. You know, it's not third world. And it had industrial level health standards and educational standards, and you know, it wasn't as rich as the first world, but it was basically an industrial society. That changed in 1989. Now it's going right back to the third world. And it's kind of interesting, speaking of the media, to see how they handle this. There was an article front page article in the New York Times a couple of days ago, maybe the Sunday edition, you know, by one of their big thinkers on Eastern Europe. His name is Michael Spector. It was called Dr. Dostoevsky's, you know, analysis or something. And he was talking about why the Soviet Union has completely collapsed. You know, like about 500,000 extra people are dying a year, you know, since 1989. Life expectancy has dropped very sharply, particularly for males. You know, the whole place is totally destroyed. In fact, you know, it looks like it's being destroyed because it's beginning to look more like the third world than it did. It doesn't look very different from Brazil. In fact, it turns out it's now at about the level of Brazil, okay? Which, well, why did this happen? One possibility is because market reforms were introduced in 1989. No, but you're not allowed to think that. In fact, the word market never appears in the article. So it's all about the Dr. Dostoevsky's analysis. Dostoevsky wrote something about the Russian soul, you know, and there's something about the Russian soul that's different. And you really have to read it. It's like a comic strip. Because it's perfectly obvious what's happening. They introduced market reform, so yeah, sure, the whole thing's looking like the rest of the third world, you know. No, it's got to be the Russian soul has never been able to do this and that. I mean, okay, so that's Dr. Dostoevsky's analysis. Somehow the Russian soul wasn't operating before November 1989, and then it suddenly started operating. I mean, you really have to have a good education to be able to handle this kind of stuff. So anyway, that was a change for Eastern Europe, but of course that had an effect. Now that it's part of the third world again, it means that you get very cheap labor, you know, right across the border. So like a German factory, say, Daimler-Benz or somebody, they can invest in, say, Poland, you know, or Russia or someplace where they get educated workers. It's not going to be true down the road, but for the moment they're still getting relatively healthy, educated workers, you know, even white, at a 10% the cost of the Western European, what the press calls the pampered Western European workers. That's what the business press calls them. You get them at 10% the cost of the pampered European workers. They don't have any benefits. If they get out of line, the state comes in and smashes their heads in. It's a big improvement, and it's a way of attacking. It's kind of like northern Mexico for us, you know. And in fact, American, like GM and those guys, they invest there too. Same reason. Well, that's an attack on the living standards for Western workers, and is recognized as such. I mean, it's all over the business press. You know, like they're very frank about it. Business Week, Financial Times, and so on, understood that what this means is another weapon against the pampered Western workers and their luxurious lifestyle, as they say. So that's a change. And of course, the collapse of the Soviet Union meant that the Soviet Union, whatever you think about it, it was a big military force. So it was a deterrent. It means there's a limit on what the U.S. can do because maybe you get in trouble. Well, with the Soviet Union gone, it frees up the deterrent. It eliminates the deterrent. It means much freer to act. The U.S. and Britain would never have put 500,000 troops in the desert in Iraq if the Russians were still around. It would have been way too dangerous. But with the Russians gone, they can do anything they want, you know. Even the invasion of Panama, you know, it's a little operation. I mean, it's kind of like, you know, footnote to history, sort of. But Elliott Abrams, the Undersecretary of State, did point out correctly that this was different from earlier U.S. interventions because there was no need for any concern about a Russian reaction anywhere. So you're kind of freer to invade other countries and stuff. So there's small, you know, there's tactical changes, but I think the big change is just that this region's been reincorporated into the world system as a service area. You know, cheap labor, a lot of resources can be robbed, you know, all this, and it has rich resources and it's a big place. So that's changed. Now, of course, it's not a homogeneous area. So there were parts of Eastern Europe that had been parts of the First World, like Czechoslovakia. You know, it was a rich industrial country. So it's kind of moving back to what it was. It'll be, at least the Czech Republic will be part of the industrial West. Western Poland was really part of Germany, more or less. So it'll become part of it again. Same with parts of Hungary and so on. But most of the region is, in fact, the whole region is going back to what it was. You know, it's more or less what's happening. And that has an effect on the international economy and on, say, Western workers, because there's other ways of smashing them over the head. These are useful things. I mean, like take, say, the trade agreements. The trade agreements they don't have much of an effect on trade, but they, in fact, if you look at NAFTA, it really hasn't changed. Everyone talks about how trade has increased between Mexico and the United States since NAFTA, which is true, but meaningless. Because if you look at the trend line, trade was growing between the United States and Mexico just normally, and it didn't change. In 1993, it's still growing at about the same rate. Actually, it slowed down a little bit if you look. But yeah, it's growing, but just continuation of what was before. However, the trade agreements have a very important effect. They are a big attack on democracy, and that's what they're intended to do. A treaty is very hard to get out of, you know. And the trade agreements, is, to use the terminology, they lock the countries into the economic reforms. Okay? So the trade agreements impose certain obligations by treaty, and countries like Mexico are locked in. That's a protection against what's called the threat of a democracy opening. I'm not making this up, I'm quoting, you know. The threat of a democracy opening in Mexico that might challenge the United States on, say, nationalist grounds or something, that's blocked by a treaty that locks them into the reforms. It also offers a threat against American workers, North American workers, you know, like the United States and Canada. They can, I don't know if you saw this study, this suppressed Labor Department study that's been leaked out here and there by Kate Bronfenbrenner of Cornell. Do you see that? There's, under NAFTA, there's kind of a range, you know, to try to get NAFTA through, they put in side provisions that allegedly protect labor rights and so on. Of course, it's a fraud. But they're there, you know. So they have to do things like carry out studies. And they did carry out a study done by Kate Bronfenbrenner's a labor economist at Cornell, well known and good one. She ran a study in which she was studying the effect of NAFTA on strike breaking in the United States, because the labor movement claimed, you know, that it's being used, that the threat of the transfer of plants is being used to break strikes. So according to the NAFTA regulations, they had to do a study. She ran the study. She found some pretty dramatic things. But the Labor Department's suppressing it. They won't let it come out. It's kind of leaked, so it's appeared here. Bits have appeared here and there. Turns out that about half the organizing efforts in the United States are broken simply by the threat of transfer. And that's tripled since NAFTA. Threat of transfer, okay? In other words, you know, you try to organize a plant and they put up big signs outside saying, okay, your job's going to Mexico and that kind of stuff. Yeah, it tends to break the strike. It's illegal. But the Reagan administration had made it quite clear to corporations that it wasn't going to enforce the law. And Bush and Clinton have continued that. So you got a criminal state behind you, you can carry out illegal activities. And that's being used to discipline and control the labor movement. That's another reason why things are going down. That's, you know, kind of thing the trade agreements are for. It locks countries into these reforms, so-called, you know, which essentially transfers power over to transnational corporations, and it makes it very hard for them to get out of it. There's another one coming along down the road, which is very serious. And you know this multilateral agreement on investors? Have you, anybody talked about that? Yeah. Okay, that's cool. Hmm? You know about that stuff? No? Well, there's actually two agreements. They're actually the same treaty, but they have two different names. One is called Multilateral Agreement on Investors. The other one, Multilateral Investors Agreement. They're the same thing. One of them's going through the World Trade Organization. The other's going through the OECD. The World Trade Organization, it's having some problems. Well, let me just tell you what it is. It's like if you were, you know, if you were an executive of General Electric, and you were asked to write the perfect agreement that would maximize profit and power and maximally destroy democracy, this is it. You know, it has every provision you can imagine. Gives free right. The drafts are sort of secret, but they've leaked. Actually, I read one, it's unimaginable. You know, like it gives investors the right to do anything they feel like. You can move funds freely. You can move factories freely. No constraints. So you don't have to worry about minority rights, about technology transfer, environmental conditions, going to special areas, you know, where you want to have development. I mean, anything that any population might want is excluded. And it's pure investor rights, okay? It allows corporations to sue governments, from local governments up to the federal government. Like if the city of Boston, you know, imposes some condition on, you know, hiring women or not polluting the environment, corporations can sue them, but it doesn't allow reciprocal rights. So it means no population can sue a corporation. I mean, it's like a complete, it virtually dismantles whatever there is of a democratic process and hands it over to private capital. Well, technically, I mean, you know, it's not supposedly secret. I mean, like it's not inside the National Security Council or something, but nobody knows about it. It was supposed to go through in May 1997, but it was delayed, and now they're aiming for May 1998. In the World Trade Organization, it's being blocked. And the reason is that countries like India and Malaysia and others are screaming about it. Because it basically turns them into wholly owned subsidiaries of foreign corporations, and they don't want that. And they have enough clout in the WTO to block it. But in the OECD, it'll probably go through. You know, that's the rich countries. So there it'll probably go through because their corporations will gain by it. Their people will lose, but that's not what they're for. And if it goes through the OECD, the other countries are forced to accept it because of the threat of closing markets, which is lethal, you know. So that means if it manages to get through the OECD, it's a world treaty. How can it get through the OECD? Well, only if people in the rich countries don't know about it. Because if they do know about it, they're going to scream bloody murder and they'll block it. So it'll probably go through in secret. I mean, not technically in secret, but without, the idea is to get it through without anybody noticing, you know, like the World Telecommunications Agreement, and like they hoped to do with NAFTA. It was intended to go through quietly. And it'll be coming up this fall, or, you know, so it's a big issue, you know, a major issue. Well, that'll have a big effect on the global economy. I mean, all of these things are moving in the same direction. I mean, it's called free trade. It's nothing to do with free trade. It's trying to transfer decisions into the hands of unaccountable private tyrannies. That's what it's actually about. There's very little to do with, I mean, it's not free trade in any meaningful sense at all. So like take say, the biggest item traded in international markets is actually aircraft. I mean, aside from oil. I mean, oil is the biggest, but, you know, nobody thinks that that's free trade. I mean, that's managed trade completely. So nobody even pretends. Aircraft is like the biggest civilian export here. And for the big countries, huge market. Well, it's now in the hands of two companies. Boeing, McDonnell has a monopoly in the United States. Airbus has a monopoly in Europe. That's it. That's world trade and civilian aircraft, and they're both government subsidized. You know, neither of them is a private corporation. Just the profits are private. That's aircraft. You take a look at telecommunications, more or less the same. I mean, the whole thing is like you know, this is an economist's scam. If the economics profession were not so tightly disciplined, there'd be a lot of talk about this, but, you know, nothing happens. Well, you know, these are all changes. I mean, these are big changes over the last 25 years. I don't think there's any reason to think that they're uncontrollable. Like the biggest change is probably in the financial capital flows, which looks as if it's controllable. At least, you know, pretty good economists have suggested ways that they think would control it. It's a matter of decision. When you talk about the globalization, first of all, a lot of that is fraud. I mean, the interwar period between the First World War and the Second World War, that was the period that was different. Look over the last couple of centuries, and you look at, say, the level of globalization of the economy, like the amount of trade or investment and that kind of stuff relative to the economy. It's the interwar period that's different. It was a dip. The world economy became less globalized between the two wars, became more regional blocs and protectionist and so on. But by now it's about back to where it was in 1913, you know, relative to the size of the economy. I mean, there are changes, but, you know, it's mostly like that. Furthermore, the internationalization, you know, the globalization is within what's called the triad, three rich industrial areas, United States, Western Europe, and Japan. About 75% of everything is within those three areas. If you look at one important way of attacking markets is what are called strategic alliances. So like, you know, the three big computer manufacturers, IBM, Toshiba, and Siemens, they don't want to have to compete with each other, you know. Make more profit if you work together and have a monopoly. So they form what's called a strategic alliance. They all work together. So like they're developing new, you know, semiconductors and all kind of stuff together. Those strategic alliances are about 90% of them are within the triad. And if you look at high technology, it's 100%. Okay, that means all of this stuff is going on within three areas where you've got parliamentary institutions. You know, you can pass laws. There's not going to be any military coups. So even without any institutional change at all, you know, forget radicalism, without any institutional change at all, it's completely within the control of, you know, under the control of simple parliamentary institutions, just that exist right now. The talk about it's being kind of out of control and, you know, the miracles of the market and all this kind of stuff, that's mostly fraud. Not totally, but mostly fraud. And think of the effect that it has. And I think you can see why it's going on. The effect that it has is to make people feel hopeless. I know if it's all laws, you know, like Newton's laws or something, and nothing you can do about it, we're victims of market processes and so on, well, the idea is you give up. What can we do, you know? So it makes people feel hopeless and apathetic and so on. On the other hand, if you look at it closely, there's no reason whatsoever to think that it's out of control even without any institutional change. Okay, so even, I mean, on very conservative assumptions, namely keep everything in place, it's controllable. And then the question comes up, why keep everything in place? You know, I mean, take, say, corporations, where'd they come from? They're pretty recent inventions. I mean, any classical liberal would scream his head off at the idea of a corporation. Corporations were created early in this century in their present form to attack market principles. That was their purpose. You know, they were designed to internalize risk and to attack the natural rights doctrine. Classical liberal doctrine is that rights inhere in human beings, like an individual has rights, not super individual organic entities. They don't have any rights. Okay, but this attacked that. In fact, the roots are rather like Bolshevism and fascism. Organic entities, which are over and above individuals, have rights. It's a major attack on the whole classical liberal tradition, you know. And in fact, conservative, you know, legal theorists and those guys were very much opposed to the judicial decisions. There were never any laws. The judicial decisions that granted corporations extra personal powers, like the right to free speech, say. I mean, in the 19th century, corporations didn't have the right to free speech. Free speech means advertising. Okay? The idea that corporations have a right to advertise would have been denounced by any classical liberal. I mean, they're not people. They don't have any rights, you know. Maybe the members of them have rights, like if it's kind of like a partnership. So the individuals have rights, but not the corporation. Or the right to, say, buy some other property. Where'd that come from? Or a protection from search and seizure, like you can't go in and get their records. I mean, that's an individual right. It's not a corporate right. Well, you know, corporations early in this century were granted huge rights, not by legislation, by courts mainly, lawyers, you know, intellectuals, including progressive intellectuals, who kind of changed the culture around. But that's recent, thin, you know, no reason why it should exist. There's good basis for just dismantling the whole apparatus and putting them under democratic control. Well, that's institutional change, and you know that gets rid of the whole system. And it's again very conservative. You know, that's going back to principles that were just standard in the 19th century. In fact, if you look further, right through the 19th century in the United States, through the mid-19th, well, late 19th century, mainstream thought was opposed to wage labor. I mean, like Abraham Lincoln, I'm not talking just about the labor movement, but Abraham Lincoln was opposed to wage labor. The Republican Party was the party of free labor after the Civil War still. Free labor means not wage labor. Okay, wage labor was considered an abomination. You know, the idea that you should rent yourself to somebody and be paid, that was considered like slavery. The North fought the Civil War under the banner of free labor, meaning no slaves, no wage labor. These are not exotic ideas, you know. Well, they can quickly become mainstream again. It's, again, a matter of, you know, subject, you know, things people can do. I mean, these ideas are not from outer space. They happen to be right in the core of American history. Actually, the New York Times in 1970 denounced wage labor as like chattel slavery. You know, it's the New York Times, you know, not a radical rag. It's not Z Magazine. You know.
So you're saying because so much of this is controlled by this triad, and this triad has democratic systems in place, that it is possible for us to make.
We're in control of the triad.
Right, but then when it comes to GATT and also the multilateral agreement, how does that play into it? Because we don't have any control of that.
Well, we do. We can block, first of all, we can get out of GATT. We can dismantle GATT by legislation. And we can block the multilateral agreement on investment. That's a treaty. It means it has to pass Congress with a 2/3 vote, in fact.
But you were stating before that it's really difficult for most countries to get out of the treaties.
It's difficult for Mexico, but nothing is difficult for the United States because it does what it feels like. If the three major powers, you know, Japan, Western Europe, and the United States, if they decide, let's say through legislation, with no institutional change, they decide, they pass legislation which says, okay, we dismantle the GATT treaty, everybody else follows. I mean, if Mexico says, I want to get out of GATT, they get smashed. You know, then all the markets of the world get closed to them. They're dead. But you can't close the markets of the world to, like if Nicaragua, like take, say, Nicaragua. Nicaragua won a world court suit against the United States. The world court ordered the United States not only to terminate the war, but also to pay billions of dollars of reparations. Okay, so the United States was ordered to pay about $17 billion of reparations to Nicaragua. Well, you know, here everybody laughs. Nicaragua has a way of enforcing that. They can close their markets to the United States. Right? That's the method permitted to them under the international law. You know, big excitement here. So, you know, on the other hand, if the United States closes its markets to Nicaragua, they're finished. So the stuff that goes on in the triad happens to dominate the world. You know, I don't know exactly how much, but probably 80% of the world's wealth or something is in there.
What kind of resistance is happening in the U.S. Towards, in response to MAI and also the Asian Pacific Economic Cooperation?
MAI, the first meeting I know of was in Boston on May 30th. I was supposed to speak at it, but I happened to be in South Africa. I don't know if any of you heard what happened. I didn't hear any reaction. But there was a kind of like a teach-in called in Boston on May, I think by Jobs with Justice or one of those groups. Nobody heard any. Yeah, I wasn't here, so I don't know what happened. But they had a pretty good bunch of people speaking, including some people who surprised me, like Raymond Vernon, you know him? He's a hotshot professor at Harvard who writes on corporations and stuff. He spoke there, which I guess against it, otherwise he wouldn't have been on the program, which is interesting. But I don't know what happened. I never heard. I was away. I think that was the first reaction. There is a group in Washington, a little research institute called Preamble. I forget what it stands for, but it's like a very good, you know, kind of research group in Washington. They've been publicizing material about that. Actually, they're the ones who've leaked the text. I got the text from them. I don't know how they got it. But I mean, technically, it's public. Like you can write to your congressional representative and demand to see it because they have access to it. You know, they may say they never heard of it or something, but you know they have. And it has to be made. A little bit about it appeared in the, some of it is leaked into the left press. Like there was a piece in the Multinational Monitor. And actually the preamble guys had an item in The Nation around January. So a little, you know, it's sort of leaking around. Actually, you ought to get somebody to write about it for Z. In fact, I'd suggest you might go to the preamble people directly. They're the ones who are right at the center. But people should know about it. It's an astonishing treaty. You just can't believe it. You know.
And what about APEC?
Well, APEC is, you know, the United States is only marginally part of it. I mean, that's really a, you know, that's the Japan-controlled area. I mean, the U.S. is there, you know. Anything, the United States is always a big player because it's so powerful, but it doesn't really run APEC. And APEC will do what it wants, I think. They're strong enough at this point to proceed. I mean, there's two big centers of power there. There's Japan, which is huge, you know. I mean, and like, its reserves are probably bigger than any other country. That's the biggest manufacturing country in the world. It's not small. And there's also overseas Chinese capital, which nobody knows how to measure, but it's a huge thing. And those two centers of power are sort of the core of APEC. The United States is part of it because you can't leave the United States out. But they seem to be moving pretty slowly. They don't want anything like the Western-style trade agreements.
So it's not sinister.
Yeah, I mean, sure, it's sinister. Like, Japan is not a nice place. You know, Singapore is not a nice place. But they're not nice in other ways. Not this way, you know. I mean, for example, every one of these countries is committed to, none of these countries accept this kind of neoliberal model that the West has tried to impose on the third world. Actually, the rich countries don't accept it either for themselves. But they're not the richest countries and they don't accept it. That's why they've developed. And they're moving in their own direction, whatever it'll be. You know. Actually, it's not too clear what it'll be. There's a lot of problems there when you look closely. Like, say South Korea. South Korea has become a major industrial power. It's under a lot of pressure to liberalize, what's called liberalize. And a lot of that's coming from rich sectors inside Korea too, you know, because they'd like to be a part of the bigger story. But there's a good possibility if they go in that direction, they'll go back to the third world. Quite possible. I mean, their progress has come from, you know, state coordination, capital controls, all sorts of other things. If they give that up, they may just, you know, become a assembly plant for Japan.
You mentioned the World Court.
Yeah.
I'm just wondering, they ruled that nuclear weapons are illegal.
They didn't quite. They were under it. It's amazing what they did do, but they were under tremendous pressure from the, you know, United States, other rich countries not to rule it illegal. And they didn't quite say that. They made a qualified statement saying that, which, you know, didn't exclude the use of nuclear weapons in what they called, you know, dire circumstances or something. Yeah.
There's recently been some action in the U.S. where that decision hasn't even been able to use the World Court. I'm just wondering how that's going to affect other international players. Is that?
Well, you know, I mean, the World Court or any of these things, it's kind of like Universal Declaration of Human Rights or international law. I mean, these are weapons against the weak. The powerful do what they feel like. So, I mean, the clearest case was the World Court decision against the United States. In the case of Nicaragua, the World Court ordered the United States to terminate the unlawful use of force, means international terrorism against Nicaragua, and to pay reparations. Congress, which was controlled by Democrats, responded at once by increasing aid to the Contras by $100 million. Okay, that was the immediate reaction. Actually, I reviewed this, I think in Z or somewhere. Across the board, everyone attacked the World Court. The World Court had discredited itself by coming out with a decision against the United States. Bob Laken, some of you may know, he's an interesting character, kind of Maoist lunatic who became a big, they needed him because this is an interesting story about the media. Typically the media, you know, if you want some position to be expressed supportive of power, you go to the local university and the proper academic department, and somebody will come out and say exactly, you know, what you want to say, and then you put it in their words, not your words. It didn't work in Central America. During the Central American Wars, it didn't work. For some reason, the Latin American Studies Association, the professional association, refused to go along with the whole business. So they were wiped out of the media. If you take a look through the 80s, nobody ever goes to the Latin American Studies Association for an opinion on anything. And what they had to do was invent a new cadre of experts. You know, they had to dredge people up from somewhere so they could be the experts. And one of the guys they got was this Bob Laken, who we know from MIT, who's an old progressive labor Maoist, who was off in Mexico talking nonsense about revolution. But he realized that, you know, that Maoism and Reaganism are very similar. And the Carnegie Foundation and the New York Review also realized it. So he quickly he became a, you know, senior fellow of the Carnegie Foundation, and he was testifying before Congress and writing long articles in the New York Review and a book and so on. And you have to understand this literature to see what he was doing. But he was writing about how the primary contradiction is between, you know, the people and the hegemonists. I mean, if you've been through all of this bullshit, you understand what this means. You know, it means the big enemies, the Russians, you know, and the sturdy peasants, you know, namely the Contras, are fighting against hegemonism, and, you know, blah, blah, blah. I mean, all this Maoist, you know, baby talk was coming out. It was all being published in the most respectable places, and it fit exactly with the picture that was needed. So Bob Laken, getting back to the World Court, after the World Court decision, you have to go to the experts. So he was approached by the New York Times, I guess, and he said, well, this just shows how the World Court is an instrument of the Soviet Union. I mean, the Russian judge on the World Court had withdrawn from the case, you know. I mean, even if he, but it doesn't matter, you know, any kind of lunacy is okay, you know, as long as it comes out the right way. That was the reaction of the World Court. Even, you know, guys who, you know, big exponents of international law, like Thomas Frank and so on, said, no, not this time. World Court is really out of line. You don't criticize the United States. And the thing disappeared. In fact, the judgment of the World Court was never even reported here. I mean, aside from places like Z, you know, like the words that I quoted, unlawful use of force. I don't think that appeared anywhere outside of maybe things I wrote. There are a couple international lawyers mentioned it. Furthermore, a crucial decision of the World Court, you know, you remember, if you recall, the aid to the Contras was always called humanitarian aid. Right to the end, in 1990, always humanitarian aid. I mean, nobody ever deviated from that. The World Court specifically addressed that question. You take a look at the World Court decision in 1986. It concludes, you know, a long legal argument, none of the aid, no matter what it is, you know, Band-Aids, going to the Contras is humanitarian aid. It is all military aid. And then they give a long analysis. Zero effect, you know. I mean, nobody ever referred to it, you know. We call it humanitarian aid, it's humanitarian aid. World Court can, you know, drop dead. That's international law. There's going to be a barrage next year about the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. You might as well get prepared for it. It's the 50th anniversary. It's going to be December '98. So there's going to be a huge business about how the United States courageously stands up for the universality of the Universal Declaration against third world relativists, you know, who try to say that only some of it applies, and so on and so forth. It's worth reading the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. The United States is in the lead in violating it in principle. And the official position of the United States, official, is that half the Universal Declaration has no standing. That's why? Because it calls for socioeconomic rights. like the right to food and health and a decent job and so on and so forth. That's the same status as anything else. But the United States is against it, so it has no standing. And the U.S. being against it doesn't make us relativists, you know. Because, you know, after all, it's the U.S. that decides what happens. We got the guns. And wait and see how many, you know, human rights specialists, you know, advocates make a fuss about this. Interestingly, even Amnesty International and Human Rights Watch, which are very good groups, they do good things, but if you look at the way they frame human rights, it's pretty much the U.S. agenda. So it's what's called anti-torture rights, not the right to food. Like Amnesty International doesn't accuse governments, like say the U.S. government, of failure to meet human rights standards because there's 30 million people hungry. Okay, it does. That's a violation of the Universal Declaration. You know? But it's not within the domain of Amnesty International or Human Rights Watch, because the framework is Western controlled. Oh, I gotta go. Shot at a couple long international trips.
Thank you. Bye. Drive safe.
It's going through the WTO and the OECD. What is the OECD? I think the right. There's so many of them.
I didn't realize when it pushed the button, I realized.
Then he said the WTO makes it into the but it's really interesting. Well, what form did I
wish I had gotten, it's gotten one that's supporting connections.
The OECD, it'll have to go through and be supported. Right, the OECD supports us.
Are you going to be selling these videos? Magazine, or will you send us also?
I'll be sending everybody that was here a flyer.
Oh, great.
On what's available, and how to get it on your local cable access station. And you can offer it for the best. What's good offer?
Now, is this stuff that you would give to Pacifica Archives, for example?
I want to be out there for the river, you know, we're just going to splash it all over the place. So you want to? Yeah, I was talking with the guy who has a relationship with
Yeah, that's amazing. I listen to CBC today. And they've reported that heavily.
Oh yeah, rule of law.
But I can tell.
Blast the film tomorrow.
What's that?
The hypochrommeter is part of Michael Abbott's economic.
And what about tonight?
Tonight? Oh yeah. Yeah.
Did you get him? Did you chase him to the car and make him stand still for a photograph? You know what? I meant to ask you.
Philippines too? Is it not happening at a greater rate and differently? Or
in different countries?
Talking about the whole world? Or
Well, I was talking mostly about the United States.
Right.
There's some very, in fact, what's true of the United States, as far as I know, is true of most of the industrial world. It's different in different countries. I mean, even within the industrial world, there are differences. So the United States has a much freer higher education system than almost every other industrial country. It's part of the reason for U.S. economic success. One of the good things about the United States is it had a mass education system. The European countries did not. They had an elite education system. After the Second World War, they did open the universities up, but they didn't provide facilities. So in you go to Italy, let's say, everybody can go to, the University of Rome, except they haven't got any facilities for anybody. Okay. Here the system developed in a rather different way. The facilities developed along with the opening up. Okay, so a lot of people here can go to college, a large part of the population. It's less true elsewhere. Furthermore, the universities in Europe and in Japan particularly are very authoritarian. It's not so much true of England, but in continental Europe, the universities are extremely authoritarian. I mean, a professor has enormous power, and people have to conform. That's very true to a much less extent here. The universities are, in fact, much more democratic for all kind of historical reasons, and that harms things. There are other differences, but the move towards making education more vocational and more applied and more short-term and more connected to corporate interests, that's happening to some extent throughout the industrial world. Maybe less here than in places like Holland. In the third world, I don't know about the Philippines, I just don't know anything, but because I haven't been there or haven't followed it, but various parts of the third, it just varies a lot. I mean, there's some places that are opening up, there's some that are, I don't think there's anything general, not that I know. Like in parts of Southeast Asia, the technical education is growing very fast. So in, say, Malaysia and Thailand, there's a lot more kind of engineering education than there was 20 years ago.
Would that be to export highly skilled people, or?
Well, they don't want to export the people. The West would be happy to have them export the people because that's that's a way of getting other people to, like, for example, the United States and Europe are quite happy to get engineers or doctors trained in the Philippines or Malaysia, and then they work here, because that means those people pay the costs and we make the profit. In fact, there have been a lot of Philippine, Turkish, and other doctors here, meaning the cost of the education is theirs, but the benefits are here. So the immigration laws are, almost every country, are set up so that trained, skilled people are allowed in, unless they have a surplus and they don't want the competition, then they may stop it. But if there's like a shortage of doctors, then you bring them in from the third world. So they don't, and those countries don't want to export their doctors. Actually, this is causing very complicated problems in a lot of places. I think I mentioned, at least to some people, that I was in South Africa a couple of weeks, about 2 weeks ago. One thing I was interested in was the role of Cuban doctors in South Africa. I wrote about this in an article in Z a couple of weeks ago, but that was just from the newspapers. And I wanted to see it on the scene. They couldn't tax the public anymore. There's a move in the last couple of years away from federal funding and towards corporate funding. It's not too great. The reason it's not too great is because the ultra-reactionaries in Congress are trying to block it, because they understand, guys like Newt Gingrich understands that you want to have federal funding because you don't want rich guys to pay the costs. You only want rich guys to make the profits. So you want to distribute, you want to socialize the costs. I mean, he understands that. So therefore he wants to keep the NSF and NIH budgets high, and the Pentagon research budget high. You notice that they're staying high. And it's the congressional so-called conservatives who are keeping them high because they understand the way the system works. You know. But there has been some change, a shift towards corporate funding. And the shift towards corporate funding has exactly the effects you'd expect. Corporate funding is short-term. They want a product. Like if Merck Pharmaceutical funds a project in the Harvard biology labs, they want a product for them, not for their competitors, right? They want it short-term, like, you know, they want it in a year or 2 years or something, not 20 years from now. And furthermore, they impose secrecy because they don't want anybody else to hear about it. Now, they can't formally impose secrecy, but they can effectively impose it by the threat of not refunding. So you get more, the effect of the shift to corporate funding is short-term projects, you know, very applied work, cut back in basic science, increase in secrecy, and it harms the long-term profitability of the, you know, of private capital. So I suspect it's not going to go too far, but it's kind of implicit in the shift to privatization. All of these things just follow along with it, and there's a lot of resistance to it, and in fact hasn't gone too far in those respects. Now there's another kind of corporatization of the universities which is also going on, but this is since the early 70s. That's in the humanities mainly, in the social sciences and so on. There was a lot of concern that in the 60s that the universities were getting out of control. You know, just too much independence. And in the 70s there was a counterattack. That's when the big foundations started coming along, and, you know, the Olin professorships of this, that, and the other thing, and a big effort to try to just use the power of the purse, which is, you know, what those guys have, to turn the universities back into conformity. And they mostly are concerned with the most concern is with the kind of policy-related areas. Like they don't care that much about, you know, ancient history. A little, but not much. What they do care about is, say, economics or political science or something like that. And in those fields, it's very orthodox. Like economics, for example, is really narrow. I mean, not much is tolerated. In political science, maybe a little more. In the humanities, the same thing's going on. So you get people giving, you know, $20 million to have a program in great books, meaning you study what we tell you. You know, don't read this other stuff like women writers from the third world and all that kind of business. So there's a lot of that going on. And that's, I don't know if you want to call it corporatization so much as just private power wanting to ensure that discipline is imposed. And that's visible. I mean, the universities actually, even the right-wing elements don't like it much because they don't want to be dictated to by rich people. So, for example, Yale, if you notice, just turned down, finally, a big grant of, I don't know, $20 million or something, a lot of money. Yeah, I mean, the people who are most worried about that are actually the scientists. And there's a lot of protest and concern. I see it a lot at MIT, or you read the science journals, it's full of it. Contrary to what a lot of people think, when the universities, of course, research is supported from the outside, obviously. Like, universities don't sell their own products. By now they're starting to do that, but not much. So up through the big growth period after the Second World War, it was federal government funding overwhelmingly. A lot of it Pentagon, you know, some of it National Science Foundation, NASA, you know, Atomic Energy Commission, mostly sort of around the military system. And during that period, it was very free. So at MIT, which is super Pentagon university, there's just no interference from the Pentagon. You do whatever you feel like. Because they understood that there was also no secrecy. They don't want any secrecy. The reason is that they more or less understood their role. Their role is to be a funnel for passing public funds into private pockets. Okay, that's essentially the role of the Pentagon, and the universities are part of it. MIT's, Stanford, Johns Hopkins, huge parts of it. They fund research and development. And then, if anything works, you hand it over to private corporations, like take, say, the internet. Okay, The internet was, all the ideas came out of the military, the ARPA, the research agency in the Pentagon. It was implemented in the universities under military contracts. This includes the software, the hardware, you know, packaging, parallel processing, advanced microprocessor design. I mean, the whole business, all publicly funded. It was, as long as that was going on, it was completely free and open, military funded for a long time. Finally, the NSF took it over. They've just, a year or two ago, handed over to private corporations. Okay. They didn't see the point of it for a long time. You know, the big entrepreneurial geniuses like Bill Gates didn't see any point to the internet. As recently as 1994, he was refusing to go to conferences on the internet because he didn't see any money that you could make out of it. Finally, the light dawned, and they realized they can take it over and make a mint out of it. So now it's handed over to private power. But the point is, as long as you have government funding, especially military funding, there's very few constraints. You can study what you want, do research on what you want. I mean, there's some, you know, they want to direct you to some things rather than others, but it's not enormous. Mostly it funded basic science and not particularly applied engineering. Actually, the same was true. There's another technique of public funding which is less obvious, and that is by allowing a monopoly. So as long as AT&T was a monopoly in the telecommunications industry, they could raise prices. You know, a monopoly can raise prices to whatever they want. Raising prices is a tax, but then they could use that tax to carry out basic research. So Bell Labs, which was there as long as AT&T had a monopoly, did fundamental research. And that's where they developed transistors and information theory and a lot of basic physics and cosmology and so on. That's, again, public funding. It looks like it's a private corporation doing it, but they can do it only because they're a monopoly and they can tax the public. So it's basically another technique of public funding. As soon as the monopoly was broken, Bell Labs went out of existence. Okay? Because for some humanities program where the guy who gave the money was insisting on having a role in appointment of professors. And that's just too much interference with private prerogatives, even for a pretty right-wing place, you know. So it's conflicted, you know. But it's, I mean, it's not that the universities were free before. They all, you know, the universities depend on wealth, you know, like 95% of the population doesn't fund the universities. They get it's private wealth, or else public money through taxes, you know, and that's like the Pentagon. That's public money, and there was a big change in the 1950s. Huge expansion of the public funding of universities mostly through the military system and other related things like NSF and NIH. And that's so far maintaining. I mean, NIH and NSF budgets have not dropped. They're kind of stable, even increasing slightly.
I have a question about thinking.
About what?
About thinking.
Thinking.
It seems like
in order
to have for radicals to pass on the institutional capacity to analyze critically and develop theory, there's a capability there that many of us have not developed or have developed with, you know,
well, most people got it knocked out of them. Right. I mean, children have it.
So the question is, as radicals, as a group, as a movement, how do we develop that, maintain it, and strengthen it, that capability?
Well, you know, I mean, I don't know. Nobody knows. I mean, there's some kind of elementary things that can be said. For example, it's very hard to do alone. It takes a very weird person to be able to sit alone, you know, in the midst of a big propaganda system and say, I don't agree, you know. And if it's not just that you get, you know, stomped, but it's just hard, you know. On the other hand, when you do it collectively, it's a lot easier. If there are people, I mean, thinking, in fact, is collective. Like, take, say, science, you know. I mean, it's very rarely done by an individual. It's an interaction. If you're in say, a graduate science course at MIT, It's, you know, the graduate students are talking, they're not copying, taking notes. You know, they're supposed to challenge and think and tell a professor he's off the wall and so on and so forth. It's a cooperative activity. And it's just as much true in any other area. You think by trying out ideas and getting somebody's reaction and then telling you something, and people bring in things you didn't know about and so on and so forth. So like you know, any kind of significant radical activity, it's going to have to be in organizations. And that develops thinking. There's no other than that. It's just you know, you figure it out for yourself. Nobody has any techniques. I mean, you have to keep an open mind, be skeptical. You know, ask for evidence when somebody comes up with a conclusion, that sort of thing. But you know, it's all kind of anything. That's, you know, either it's obvious or nobody knows. I mean, that's. I think that's the general answer. Yeah.
Back to what you were saying about this sort of limited corporatization of education. Are you talking primarily about the U.S.? Are you talking about?
You know, what do they think about the Cuban doctors? And it turns out to be quite complicated and interesting. There's a lot of opposition to the Cuban doctors on the part of the certain sectors of the population, including the medical profession, but others too. And on the other hand, in the rural areas where they go, there's apparently a lot of support for them because they're there. It turns out to be quite a complicated story. Under the apartheid regime, they were bringing in doctors from the black African countries, like Ghana, say, and Kenya, and so on. So doctors from those countries were coming into South Africa, which is a rich country, and being sent off to the black rural areas. Okay. Now the surrounding countries didn't like it because it's a brain drain. You know, like Ghana is training doctors, and they end up in South Africa. So for Ghana, it's a loss. You know, the Mandela government, when it came in order to stop this sort of robbery of the surrounding countries, prevented doctors from coming from the surrounding black countries. So they stopped that arrangement, okay, as a gesture of solidarity toward the surrounding black countries. But of course that meant there's now a shortage of doctors in South Africa. The white doctors don't want to go out and work, and they want to, you know, live in Johannesburg and be rich. And the new black bourgeoisie has the same intention. They want to live in Cape Town and Johannesburg and so on and make money and be specialists. So what happens to the whole country? Well, the black doctors who were providing some services, not fantastic, but at least some services, they're now cut off as a gesture of solidarity to the surrounding countries. And Cuban doctors are coming in, but that leads to extremely complicated relations of, you know, attitudes towards what's going on. Like, why do we have to have Cuban doctors when we could have had black doctors, say, from Ghana? So there's that kind of feeling. And then the medical students don't like it because they're, you know, being undercut to a certain extent. So it's complex. That's one kind of brain drain problem. And you find other things in other third world countries. Last week, just a couple days ago, I was in Israel and Palestine. And there it's extremely tricky. Like, they badly need doctors in the occupied territories. But the medical system, which was always bad, is collapsing totally. But where are they going to get them from? Israeli doctors don't want to go. Egyptian doctors refuse to go. They hate the Palestinians. The Palestinian doctors say if they're trained in Israel, they now have a niche in Israeli society. So the Israeli doctors tend to go into the Jewish Israeli doctors tend to go into specialties because they make a lot of money, you know, and that leaves an opening for general practice. And the oppressed section of the Israeli population, namely the Palestinians, they're using that opening. So they'll move into general practice at a lower much lower salaries, while the Jewish Israeli doctors go into private practice. But that also means they don't want to go off into the territories where it's really tough work. They're very poor and oppressed, dungeons basically. So there's a big problem.